All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today at the Department of Housing for our Home American Rescue Plan Allocation Plan public hearing. My name is Ruby Dillon Williams. I'm the Assistant Deputy Director of Programs here at the Department of Housing. Also on the line today is Deputy Director Cindy Stotler and two of our program administrators, Kathy Blodgett, our CD&R program administrator, and Sherry Boucher, our rental programs administrator. And as you hear about our allocation plan, you'll see how the two program administrators that I mentioned are critical in supporting how these funds are allocated through the programs that they administer. Also on the line today joining us is our Consolidated Plan and Annual Action Plan Consultant, Martina Keel, and Martina is going to be leading the presentation today on behalf of the Department of Housing. So I'm going to kick it off to you, Martina. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ruby. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here today. As Ruby said, we're going to talk about the State of Arizona HOME-ARP allocation plan. And specifically, our agenda for the hearing today is to let you know what the planned uses and distribution methods of the HOME-ARP allocation are planned to be. I'm going to do a brief overview of the program requirements. Many of you have heard this information before. We're going to keep repeating it every time we go through the notice. We learn a little bit more. And I would like to add that there will be program policies and procedures that will be put out along with notices of funding availability that are going to go into greater detail about what the requirements are. We just want to make sure you understand as you're thinking about how these funds are going to be used or are planned to be used and how you might use them, that you understand at least a baseline of what the requirements are. So we'll do that and I'll take public comments and then we'll talk about next steps. So you're all muted. You are welcome to, at any time, if you have a question, you can enter that into the chat box, raise your hand, unmute yourself if you're feeling like you've got to have an answer at this very moment. And I'm more than happy to entertain whatever questions you might have to make sure that you're clear on where the Department of Housing is headed with the HOME-ARP allocation. So the department will receive an allocation of $21.8 million. And the HOME-ARP allocation plan will be submitted to HUD after we get through the public comment period. And it will specify these particular identified uses of the HOME-ARP allocation. First, rental housing at roughly 38% of the available funds, $8.2 million. Non-congregate shelter at $8.1 million, or 37% of the allocation. Supportive services, which many people have mentioned are critical when we're dealing with HOME-ARP qualifying populations, 10% of the allocation, or $2.1 million. Nonprofit operating and nonprofit capacity building, 5% each. Also ADOH administration and planning, 5%. So the nonprofit operating and the nonprofit capacity building are both capped at 5% of the total allocation. Administration and planning is actually capped at 15%. However, the state has elected to take 5% so that we can get more units and more assistance out to the people who are most in need. So I want to talk a little bit about qualifying populations. So 100% of the non-congregate shelter and supportive services and 70% of rental units have to benefit at least one of these four top qualifying populations. People who are homeless as defined by the McKinney-Vento Act, who are at risk of homelessness also as defined by the McKinney-Vento Act. People who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking. And this is going to be per the VAWA regulation. And if you're familiar with housing choice vouchers or public housing, it spells out very clearly how VAWA works, and it will also apply to home, that methodology. and also to victims of human trafficking per the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. And then we've also got people who were previously homeless, but are currently housed with some sort of assistance, and they're in need of additional assistance to prevent repeat homelessness. So there's a pretty broad range of qualifying populations, all generally speaking, homeless or at risk of homelessness. There's also an additional category for supportive services. So in addition to benefiting those top four categories, households with income who are less than 30% of AMI, extremely low income households, who are severely cost burdened or paying more than 50% of their income toward housing are also eligible, as are households with income below 50% of the area median income and at risk of homelessness. So the supportive services has a bit of a broader definition of qualifying populations and who can benefit from HOME-ARP funds than do the capital categories of HOME-ARP funding. HUD also says very specifically that they would like for veterans to be considered, but they are not necessarily a qualifying population. They are part of a qualifying population. So that said, in keeping qualifying populations in mind, there's also a bunch of cross-cutting regulations. So if you've used HUD community planning and development resources in the past, that would be home funds, CDBG funds, you know that there are a lot of requirements. And this is just a list of them. I'm not going to read through all of them for you, but if you are going to be using HOME-ARP funds for capital investment, that is non-congregate shelter or rental housing, there are a lot of regulatory requirements that are going to have to be met. So you should plan on, if you are unfamiliar with these requirements, learning about them in advance of making application. There are handbooks and all kinds of guidance on the Arizona Department of Housing website under the handbooks. And you can also go to HUD Exchange and find additional information there. But I just want you to be aware, again, in advance, that there are a lot of requirements associated with these resources. So let's talk a little bit about rental housing, what it can be used for, and how the state plans to distribute those resources. So first off, it can be used for construction, acquisition, and or rehabilitation. And in each HOME-ARP project, so each, say you have 10 units in a home project, not less than 7 or 70% of those units would have to be rented by qualifying populations. So if we go back to that qualifying population slide, keep those populations in mind. And they can pay not more than the low home or FMR for rent, and that is per the home regulation. 3 of those 10 units, or 30% of the units, could then be rented to low-income households. That's households with income up to 50% of the area median income, and they could pay the high home rent or FMR, whichever is lower. The key with the rental housing is that you have to evidence positive cash flow for at least 15 years. And that's gonna, the period of affordability, if you will, or the use restrictions are going to depend upon the type of activity that you're doing. So that minimum 15 years is going to apply to a straight up acquisition project. It gets longer if you're doing new construction, 20 years as an example. The nice thing about HOME-ARP funds is that because the populations who are going to be occupying the units have such low incomes, the state is able to allocate funds for operating to those HOME-ARP units. And they can do that either on an ongoing basis with continual review, or it can be capitalized on the front end. And then you can report back on how you're using that reserve. In addition, 10 tenants can receive HOME-ARP supportive services, of which there is a very long list. So that will help to help our tenants to increase their incomes and hopefully become independent and move up in the housing market. So rental housing resources will be distributed by the state through a notice of funding availability. As I mentioned earlier, program guidelines will be included in that NOFA, as will the underwriting criteria. The state and all participating jurisdictions are required to have underwriting criteria for HOME-ARP funds. So you will see those. That's something that's being worked on now, but it will come out with the NOFA. And with the NOFA, you will get all of those requirements. In addition to that, the state can use part of its allocation to fund underfunded and unfunded CDBG CV projects that were in the queue, and just there was not enough money to help them, and those projects are waiting, and they've met basically most of the requirements for HOME-ARP funding. So there'll be NOFA and allocation to CDBG CV projects if those projects elect to accept the HOME-ARP funds. Non-congregate shelter is something that we don't typically see in the home program, but it is an eligible activity in HOME-ARP. Just like rental housing, new construction, or acquisition and/or rehab are eligible activities. This will be one or more buildings that provide private units or rooms. So when we say private units, we're saying sort of like rental housing, or it can be rooms where we have shared kitchen and bathroom facilities, as long as it is non-congregate. That's HUD's definition. There will be no lease or occupancy agreements because it is shelter. The shelter will be restricted to occupancy by the qualifying populations for 10 to 15 years, depending on the activity. So again, new construction is going to be 15 years, straight acquisition, 10 years. Unlike rental housing, the state may not use HOME-ARP funds to provide an operating subsidy for non-congregate shelter, so no operating subsidy. However, the state may provide supportive services funding for tenants or occupants, if you will, of the non-congregate shelter. One of the things, if you have, say you decide that you want to go to the non-congregate shelter route, you have the ability to convert the non-congregate shelter to rental housing after a period of time. That period of time is 3 to 10 years. And again, it depends upon 3 years for just straight acquisition. It's going to be 10 years for new construction. If conversion is elected, it has to be elected at the time of application. So you need to you'll need to make that decision in advance. And once the project is converted, the rental housing clock starts ticking. So say we had a 10 new construction project, 10 years is non-congregate shelter. If it's converted to rental housing, then there'll be a 15-year rental housing clock attached to that. And unfortunately, the state is not allowed to use HOME-ARP funds to help pay for that conversion to rental housing, nor are they allowed to provide additional operating assistance after the conversion occurs. So the way we're reading this is it's probably best to go straight rental housing or straight non-congregate shelter unless you have very unique market conditions. And you're very certain that you are going to be able to operate for the very long term as either shelter or rental housing. Just like the rental housing, non-congregate shelter funding will be allocated through a notice of funding availability. The program guidelines and underwriting criteria will be included in that. And just like rental housing, there are unfunded and underfunded CDBG CV projects that are in the queue and waiting to be funded. So we might also use HOME-ARP funds to fund those particular projects. So let's talk about supportive services, because this is really an exciting aspect of the HOME-ARP funding and something that our providers have been telling us for a long time are critical to the success of these projects. So supportive services has there's numerous services that you can provide, in three categories. The key with the supportive services is there can be no duplication of benefits. So you have to go through an exercise with your occupants or with your tenants to determine what services they are already providing. And at that point, then you can add additional supportive services for them. So qualifying populations, those first four populations, there's a very long list. It's the McKinney-Vento supportive services. So I'm not, again, going to read through all of them, but it's pretty much every supportive service that you can think of that a qualifying population might need. When we look at other populations, those people who are at risk or unstably housed, who are receiving supportive services, they're going to be the same eligible activities, but they have to be documented differently. So this is going to be in the policies and procedures as to how you document what services are being provided and how you are qualifying the individual or family for the services. And then when it comes to both qualifying and other populations, housing counseling, all the housing counseling activities that would normally be associated with renters are eligible supportive services. The only real requirement is that there has to be a housing counseling work plan developed with the tenant or occupant that says this is when we plan to complete our counseling services, and this is the planned outcome of the services. In terms of distributing the supportive services resources, they will be made available as part of the rental housing and non-congregate shelter NOFAs. So since we have the ability to provide those resources with the units, we want to make sure that we're making it as easy as we can by putting it all in one place for you to apply for. There may also be a separate notice of funding availability issued at some point, particularly if the demand is low or if the demand changes and we need to look at other ways to get those resources out.
Martina, it's Ruby. I just wanted to jump in here because you discussed duplication of benefits, and it's a question that we receive quite often at the Department of Housing because the local jurisdictions also received HOME-ARP dollars and are working on their listening sessions. So would you be able to just spend a minute talking about if HOME-ARP funds are applied for through either the city or other jurisdictions that have those dollars available as well? How will that affect an application to the state? Itemizing what they're applying for amongst the different jurisdictions. But I just want to spend a little bit of time because it's a question that we're getting quite often.
Okay, if you're looking at mixing state HOME-ARP and local HOME-ARP resources, you are going to have to meet all of each jurisdiction's policies and procedures and underwriting criteria. So unlike the regular home program, where when you have a local jurisdiction and a state jurisdiction jointly funding a project, the state is required to actually transfer their home funds to the local jurisdiction. That is not the requirement with HOME-ARP funding. So you may be having to work with both jurisdictions in order to ensure that the project is going to actually be feasible and viable based on both of their requirements. So each jurisdiction is going to look, are you getting too much money? That's what underwriting, subsidy layering, and that whole process is all about. When we talk about duplication of benefits in the HOME-ARP program, it's really about the duplication of supportive services and not necessarily about the duplication of actual cash resources, because that's taken care of through the underwriting processes of both entities. So if you were to get supportive services resources for a specific project, say from Pinal County, from their home program, and then you came to the state and you said, we also want to get supportive services resources from you for the same project, you would actually have to go back and document what services are being provided by each specific entity. And actually, you would be making it much more difficult for yourself in the long run to do it that way. My suggestion would be look at capital from one source if you have two sources lined up, and supportive services from another if that's possible. So duplication of benefits is on the micro level, at the beneficiary level when we're looking at HOME-ARP. Does that help, Ruby?
Yes, and thank you for making that clarification specific to supportive services. So I appreciate that. And if anyone else has a question, I know a lot, was just going through who the participants are on the call, and I know that we've encouraged you to reach out to the local jurisdiction. So if anybody has a question or might have a parallel application they're considering or already in with another jurisdiction, please feel free to ask questions either now or at the end or whenever you're comfortable posing that question. Thanks, Martina.
You're welcome. I also want to add that I know there's often, how are we going to match this? And even the HOME-ARP notice from HUD speaks to the low-income housing tax credit program. And, how do we mix these resources with LIHTC units? And I just want to remind you that these are federal funds. And loaning them in order to not impact your basis may not make sense given the income of the population. So you want to be keeping that kind of in the back of your mind as you're putting your deals together if you're thinking about HOME-ARP, unless it is very specifically a supportive housing project. So let me talk a little bit about nonprofit operating and capacity building. As I mentioned early on, capped at 5% of the total allocation. And then there's caps within each of these kind of sub allocations of funds. For operating, it's general operating only. So as long as there's no cost center associated with something, you're good. So executive director salaries, rent, general operating expenses, up to 50% of those general operating expenses can be covered, up to $50,000 per fiscal year. So if you're a nonprofit organization and you're doing a HOME-ARP project and you could use some operating help, I don't know too many nonprofits who don't need operating help. You can get the operating funding for multiple fiscal years up to $50,000 a year or 50%. If that's combined with capacity building assistance, which is really about bringing on additional staff, hiring consultants to build your capacity, not to do the work on your behalf, but really expanding your ability to deliver HOME-ARP projects or services, then that cap goes up to $75,000 a year again, but still 50% of general operating. So these funds will be distributed just like supportive services resources as part of the rental housing and non-congregate shelter notices of funding availability. So if we have nonprofit applicants, they can apply for these resources at the same time. There will also be a separate NOFA issued because the state is allowed to provide these resources, particularly the capacity building resources, to an entity that plans to apply for HOME-ARP resources at some point in the future. So those are the conditions around that operating and capacity building. If you're looking at capacity building resources, say you're thinking about a HOME-ARP project for a future year and you want to apply for the capacity building resources, understand that if you take them, there are consequences if you fail to receive project funding in the future. So the department and all participating jurisdictions are really going to have to take a close look at where you're at in terms of your capacity and how your capacity will be built to actually undertake a project. So, I wish this was so much easier, but the HOME program, if you're familiar with it, is not easy in and of itself. And these additional and very different requirements aren't making it a whole lot easier. But I'm not going to talk about program administration from the state standpoint, because it's pretty obvious based on our conversation today, the tasks that the department's going to be doing. So I would like to entertain any comments or questions about the planned uses or the methods of distribution. I'm gonna go back here to the planned uses so you can your memory can be refreshed as to how the resources are planned to be expended. So any questions or comments? All right. Well, maybe you have other thoughts about how you're going to, maybe it's too much to digest, or you just already know exactly where you're headed with it. So where are we going from here? Written comments will be accepted through February 9th. HOME-ARP has a 15-day public comment period. And that public comment period started today. The HOME-ARP allocation plan is posted on the ADO website, so you can find it there. Feel free to read through it. You will see in there, it goes back and talks about the outreach that was conducted, provides the rationale for the distribution, planned distribution of funds, and pretty much describes everything that we talked about today. But if you're interested in data and that sort of information, I would encourage you to read through that. Regardless, you can submit your written comments through February 9th to public comment at azhousing.gov. We'll collect those comments and provide responses to them. They will also be included in the HOME-ARP allocation plan substantial amendment to HUD. Once the public comment period is expired, we will bring all those public comments together, add some certifications and other HUD required documents, and submit the amendment to HUD. They will have a 45-day review period. So the earliest that the funds will actually be available for distribution by the state will likely be around April 1st. So again, any questions, any comments? Okay. Ruby, you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, thank you. I'm surprised there's no questions, but probably folks are just kind of taking it in, and feel free to reach out to us, submit those written comments. And I know that a lot of you have been waiting for this resource from the agency. So please know we are working as quickly as we can with HUD's requirements and publication periods and whatnot. And so it's a tough process, but we're excited that we're at this phase. So we welcome your comments. I missed introducing Olivia Gutzman, who's also one of our program administrators. She is on the call with us today. All of our program administrators are here to provide technical assistance as needed to answer any questions you have. So feel free to reach out, and we look forward to hearing from you, and the next steps in this process are coming soon. So thank you, Martina, for leading the discussion today. And thank you all for participating. We appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.